I'll start going over the stuff that you might, want to kind of take a look at, possibly for the exam. The client has an image where they like the position of everything here, the arms, all this stuff. They like the head over here. They don't like that head. They don't like this. We want to swap it over. The trick when you're swapping stuff over is to make sure that there's no obvious signs of where you've done the work. And in this case, it was fairly simple. We just selected always more than you think you need. In this case, I grabbed a good chunk around the outside there. And we can copy it and paste it over. And when you're doing the compositing, watch out for things like repeating patterns, double images, stuff like this would be bad. And think about where the alignments are going to go. Like in this case here, we decided that if we lined up her face, it would be floating quite a bit higher above her neck than if we lined up the necklace. So look around for things that you think might be a good interface between the two layers there. And then you can basically use a layer mask. You notice I dropped the opacity so I could see through both the layers at the same time. Bring the opacity back up. Hide it with a layer mask. How did I call up a hide all layer mask instantly like that? I mean, I could just make a new layer mask and then I could invert it, Command I. That's a whole section of my life I'll never get back. How did I call up the boink, hide all layer mask? Option, held down the Option key when I clicked the new layer mask icon. Then just grab a paintbrush and watching out for edges that don't line up, just bring back the things that you need. And there may be a little bit more to it than that, but things like this would be something to watch out for. This part of the necklace, well, the necklace is okay, but here we got this weird offset. So decide which one you're going to keep, which one you're going to get rid of. And when you're painting on a layer mask, make sure, first of all, that you have pure black and white as your foreground and background. What's the keyboard shortcut for that? D for your default. If you need to reverse them, excellent. And 100% opacity. Keyboard shortcut for 100% opacity? 0 gives you 100%. And then you can completely hide, or in this case, reveal the areas that you want. All right. Oops. OK, she has an eye in her forehead. That's creepy. So we would either hide or, in this case, I guess, get rid of. To make sure little things like that haven't been missed, I'm going to make my layer mask visible. How do I make my layer mask visible? Hold down the Option key when I click on the layer mask. Option, click on the layer mask, makes it visible. And geez, I did miss a lot of stuff there. What's that looking like? Oh. Ah, look at that. See, I missed stuff, and we have some duplication. We have things that are obviously the same bits of the image. So Option click just to make sure I haven't missed anything, and then just get rid of all the problem areas. Excellent. Okay. And we did the same sort of deal with the collars here. Retouching. There's the kind of over the top, if the model doesn't recognize yourself, that's fine. Fashion style of retouching, make them skinny, make them, whatever you need to do to the face. But then there's the real people style, which is kind of where the bread and butter work is. The real estate agents, the annual reports, the business people, the people that need to look like who they are. And we refer to that as the real people style of retouching. These are real people that you're working on. They're doing their day-to-day jobs. And if somebody meets them and you've retouched them so they look like 20 years younger than they're supposed to, they're like, who the heck is that person? What are some things to keep in mind when you're doing real people style retouching? Well, let's say it had like a little mole or something like that. Should you remove it? No, I mean, they know it's there. If they ask you to, you can pop it out. But otherwise, what could you do to kind of soften something like that out? You don't want to take it out completely. What if I took a clone stamp, lower opacity, maybe 50% or so, and just kind of cloned over that way? Yeah, that kind of stuff works. Some soft edges. On a brush for, let's say you wanted to soften these things here out. If you remove them completely, and I see people do this sometimes, they just go in and they completely remove all little lines under the eyes and they get this kind of squidgy, puffy-eyed sort of look. For a real people style stuff, they know they have those crow's feet, they know they have those lines. So maybe a lower opacity on the stamp, maybe 20, 30% or so, and just kind of soften them out while letting them remain. There's a before and there's an after. Again, they know they have them, they recognize that as themselves. Skin texture, we looked at a bunch of ways of softening out skin texture. We looked at some kind of fast ways. Oftentimes when I'm doing retouching, I just do it manually. I just grab that clone stamp, that fairly low opacity, maybe 20% or so. And let's say there was a little bit of texture on the skin there that I wanted to soften out. Respecting gradients always. Remember, there's always gradients in an image. We've got dark to light across here, so there's a gradient going this direction. If I wanted to soften out some of this texture, would I go parallel to or perpendicular to the gradient? Perpendicular. If I go parallel to, I might end up pulling a light area into a dark area, that would be bad, or light into dark that way. But if I go perpendicular and fairly low opacity, I can soften out that texture. There's a before and there's an after, without changing the overall brightness of different areas. When you get into things like around noses, around eyes, the healing tools, I find, they don't know what the contours of a nostril are around here versus around here. They don't know what the contours are around an eye. You guys do. The healing brush, spot healing brush, I find they make some odd decisions around here. Again, I would just go in with a regular old clone stamp. Make sure you know which direction the gradients are going, and clone them around. Again, watching out for gradients, and trying not to remove too much texture. What does skin start to look like if you overdo it? Like glass or wax, or it gets this kind of like, almost like, porcelain-y Barbie doll sort of look, which you see it all the time on people's Instagram, and oh, look at the retouching I've done, and everyone replies, love it, and stuff like that, but the clients don't, and they're the ones with the money. You guys have gotten those comments, haven't you? On some stuff. Sometimes it really is awesome stuff. Just be careful with the retouching, that you don't kind of overdo it. And again, if you get shadows like this, there's a few ways this could be dealt with. We could use the old clone stamp again and just kind of soften it out that way. What's another way I could try to lighten up this area? We could try a healing brush, but again, with those gradients, you never quite know. What if we just did some dodging and burning? What if I took a new layer, popped it into soft light, took a paintbrush, and again, that fairly low opacity, and with some white paint, I could just kind of go in and lighten the area up that way. So there's a bunch of ways this sort of stuff can be done. There's just with dodging and burning. It could be done with a clone stamp. As long as it looks good in the end, it's the right thing to do. Again, we talked last week about things like, on eyes, I often find that a little bit of lightening on the inside, the opposite side to the catch light, kind of adding contrast around can often help the image. All right, what else could you need? Oh, fabric. If you're shooting models that are wearing clothing, as is often the case, we took a look at a few different ways of removing wrinkles in fabric. Like this one here, we said, okay, well, if you step back, we've got kind of a natural sweep to the flow of the fabric here. But if you go into a bit of a closer level, we got some big bumps, we've got some little bumps. And one of the things we talked about when you're doing a retouching is to kind of hit the worst bits first, especially when you're doing things like retouching stray hairs, stuff like that. And here I'm seeing some pretty big stuff around here. What you wouldn't want to do is go in real close and start with the little tiny things first, because often when you get into this bigger stuff, you're going to kind of smooth that stuff out. But how would I smooth this while keeping the flow of the fabric? What could I use? We're kind of back to that clone stamp again. New transparent layer, grab that clone stamp. And again, with a fairly low opacity, in this case, we kind of figured around 50%-ish, or you could go lower if you want to do multiple passes. But if you do a 50%, option click up here and kind of sweep downwards. Option click down here and sweep upwards. Each one kind of averages out the wrinkles. Well, will that work if there's a texture in the fabric? It wouldn't work. Like if she was wearing a plaid wedding dress, you'd probably have to do something else. Like let's say, for example, she had some, yes, question? It will if you set it to current and below. If it's set to current layer and your current layer is a transparent layer, you're cloning transparent onto transparent. With current and below, it'll grab the pixels from there and clone it up top. Now for this one here, well, the clone stamp one would have some what we call dire consequences, because it would really mess up that texture, wouldn't it? That would be bad. Eventually, it would just soften out into nothingness. What could I do? There's a distinct, look, it's a flat panel and then a hard edge. It's not actually darker here than it is over here. It's just the fact that this has the light shining on it, this doesn't, which gives us the distinct impression of a hard corner, not a rounded kind of cylindrical shape like a torso would have. What could I do to round this out without destroying this texture around here? Yeah, we do some dodging and burning again. What if I made that new transparent layer, and instead of cloning on it, I popped it again into that soft light blending mode, took a paintbrush, and just a little bit of lightening down this side over here. And if I did a little bit of darkening on this side over here, instead of having that kind of hard, angled edge across, now we've got this kind of cylindrical wrap around. And a little bit of darkness down here can help that, up around here. Again, I'll let you guys kind of play around with them, but oftentimes for things with fabric textures, beadwork, lace. If it's a fairly chunky sweater that you can see the details in it, you don't want to soften that out. A little bit of dodging and burning can really give a much smoother sort of look to that image in there. Things like stray hairs. Well, this one, this is the first thing we practiced when we were taking a look at stray hairs. We said, well, what if we took a clone stamp, and if, say, we wanted to get rid of this hair going this way, what if we just cloned this hair, doink, right over top of it? If you go too low, whoops, not going to look good. If you go too high, not going to look good. But if you get it nicely aligned, you can simply get rid of that stray hair as though it had never existed. And then we took a look at it in an actual image. And we zoomed in on some of these guys around here. And this is where I kind of introduced the idea of pacing yourself, basically. Not spending 7 hours getting every teeny tiny little thing in this area and having no time left when you get to other areas. But also respecting those gradients again. With this one here, we said, okay, well, what if we took, instead of like a big soft brush and said, I'm going to clone out these stray hairs and blum, 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 blum. And sadly, I see stuff like this sometimes. A lot of destruction back there. Smaller brush. Again, we've got these gradients going different directions. It's going from dark to light this way. So if I go again perpendicular from here across to there, works great until, I don't know, something like this happens. Just means we need to change the direction we're cloning from. So maybe now I'll come from the top, clone straight down. Again, perpendicular to the direction of the new gradient in there. And little stray hairs that go over top of other stray hairs, diabolical stray hairs. We want to keep this here, this nice natural flow of the hair below, but this tiny little thing around here has to go. And we said, okay, well, if this has a direction to it, what if we clone in the same direction as the hair we want to keep? So what if I said, I'll take this, boink, and I'll stick it right over top of this. Run sideways across the evil hair that we want to get rid of. And the source, the plus sign, and the destination are parallel with the hair we want to keep until we get around here. Suddenly it's not working so well. What do we do about that? Yeah, change the direction we're cloning from. This direction of this hair worked fine in this area, but now we have this direction of this hair. So I'll sample here, and I'll go this direction. It's changing again over here. I'll grab this, and I'll get rid of it. As opposed to kind of smudging everything around and saying, well, the hair's gone, but there's a whole lot of stuff that's been kind of messed around with. Ideally, you want to disturb as few pixels as possible. Work in such a way that if you turn the layer off and on, it simply looks as though the hair's vanished with no further damage done to the image. Any questions on stray hairs? Excellent. How many people were disappointed that the hairs weren't actually little rabbits? It was a little bit. Hairs, rabbits. Stray, well, hairs is rabbits, and stray hairs is little rabbits running around your back. Never mind. We talked about Moray. What caused Moray again? The pattern that results from the vertical and horizontal pattern of your sensor interfering with a vertical and horizontal pattern of something in your image. You'll often see it on a screen door. You're doing a Algonquin cottage, and they've got a screen door there, and you see these weird kind of like wood grain patterns happening in the screen door. Fabrics, especially things like sportswear, things that have a very fine weave to it, you'll notice that you start seeing these kind of patterns happening in it. The best thing is to simply avoid them. And we said some things you can do to avoid the moray. Well, it's when that pattern is almost the same size as your sensor. The vertical and horizontal of the pattern starts messing up with the vertical and horizontal of your sensor. What if you could change the size of that pattern? Make it larger or smaller, zoom in, zoom out, step back, step forward. Also, if the orientation of it changed a little bit of a rotation. You're always better to remove it in camera than in Photoshop. But in a worst case type scenario, if you had something like, actually, there were two types of moray that we talked about as well. There was the pattern moray, which is this light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. And, well, this also has some color moray in there as well. Why would colors start to appear in a moray pattern? Well, how does your sensor work? Does your sensor see colors? It doesn't, does it? It just sees black and white. And to get around that, they stick a color filter over top of every single pixel, either a red filter, a green filter, or a blue filter. And if that moray pattern is mostly falling across red pixels, well, you're going to start getting a bit of a reddish sort of tone. If it's most in the areas where they constructively interfere with each other. And in areas where they destructively, you'll get the opposite. In this case, a bit of a cyan color in there. So that's no good. How do we get rid of that moray pattern in there? Well, the pattern, the color moray. It kind of related to a technique we used when we added that sky behind that castle. And there were those trees, and the castle had that blue fringe around it, that chromatic aberration. And we said, this blue color around here is no good. And we got rid of it. A blending mode on a transparent layer in color. Yeah, so if I made a new transparent layer here, and I set it to color blending mode, we've basically changed the rules for this layer, the rules of how it's going to interact with the pixels below. If I paint, red, green, blue, rather than seeing, let's say I did paint some red, you would normally expect, let's do 100%, red. But by changing the blending mode of the layer to color, the only thing this layer can do is impose its color onto the pixels below. Can't change the brightness, contrast, anything like that. What if I sampled the color I needed it to be? So I said, okay, well, this looks like the color of the sweater here. So if I sampled that and painted that over top, it'll take out the color, Moray, okay, but it'll still have a little trouble with that pattern Moray. What did we do to get rid of this pattern Moray? Same sort of thing as wrinkles, wasn't it? We said, what if we made a new transparent layer, grabbed a clone stamp, and I think in the folder, yeah, this was the example I said, what if we said, okay, at 50% opacity, I sampled a light patch, boink, my clone stamp, and then I cloned it over top of a dark patch, like that. It should average out, if I get it close enough, to nothing. It should average out to no brightness. And what if I could do that on the Moray pattern? So what if I took, not that, a little bit of this lighter band and put it over a darker, maybe not the one right beside it. One of the things when you're using a clone stamp, if you're cloning really close to your source, like your source and your destination are right beside each other, you'll start noticing repeating patterns appearing across. So instead of going directly from this one onto that one, maybe I'll jump over a little bit and clone over, and that can help soften that pattern out. Again, this isn't going to work on beadwork, lace, that kind of stuff. But Moray patterns tend to be appearing on fairly smooth fabrics, around the sleeve on a guy's business suit. You're photographing for a real estate company, and it's appearing in the roof tiles of the building, or that screen door on the front of that cottage that they're trying to rent out. So you can go in, and if the frequency changes, here you notice we have light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. It's kind of like a 10, 15 pixel frequency. Here, the frequency gets a lot smaller. Now it's like a 3 or 4 pixel frequency. Well, you just need to change your sampling distance from here, boink, from the light over to the dark, and average those out to nothing. So fairly simple way of removing both color Moray and pattern Moray. Now, if that didn't work, there could be areas like up around here, like, well, there's no repeating pattern for light and dark. Well, then we can get into the same sort of deal of making a new layer, soft light, paintbrush, and you can remove it simply by painting black on the light areas and white on the dark areas. And again, just kind of average those out to no Moray. So then you have Moray, no Moray. What else could we need? Oh, channel masking. We took a look at channel masking. And there were a few examples of times where this came in handy. The very first one we did was this lady here standing on the fence. And we said, well, she's backlit. You got the sun shining through. So she's a little bit dark. If we brighten her up, the sky goes too bright. If we darken the sky down so the sky looks good, she looks too dark. And then said, well, what if we opened up this darker version and we took a look through the channels here? And we said, okay, red channel, the sky, it's blue, so it's fairly dark up there. There's a lot of kind of reddish, warmish tones in skin, so it comes really light. There's not a lot of contrast between the foreground and background. The green channel is a little bit better, but the blue channel is pretty awesome. There's still some gray tones in there, but what if we duplicated this channel and threw on some levels, image adjustment levels, or Command L, and we got rid of all the gray tones. So the background became white and the foreground became black. Now, if we need black in the foreground and white in the background, shouldn't we just pull these right up against each other? Wouldn't that do a great job? Or might it make the edges a little too jagged? Yeah, one of the things when you're doing a channel mask, and sometimes there's some trial and error. Sometimes you get it done, you're like, oh, it's a little bit, it's cutting in too close, or there's a little bit of a fringe left. Step back and play around with the positions of these. The more of these little gray pixels we get in here, the softer that transition edge is going to be. And we can push it inwards, outwards. We can change where it cuts off. And because it's going to ultimately be a layer mask, and because it's creating what we call an alpha channel, we can change it at any time as well. So if I hit OK on this, and oh, there's still some gray tones left in there. Not that big of a deal. I could either fix it now, just take a paintbrush and paint some black over top of it. Awesome. Or if I go back to my channels here, and actually I should make the lighter exposure of it. Normally when you're doing channel masking, you're just cutting the person out. But in this case, we said we want to put that lighter exposure of her on top. So there's our lighter version. We duplicate that over to the other layer, and then we call up that alpha channel. Select, load selection, and an alpha channel basically is any channel that's not your color information. It's not red, it's not green, it's not blue, it's not the RGB composite. In this case, it was that copy of the blue channel. Hit OK. Now we've got a selection that represents the background, and if I were to give this a layer mask, we have the exact opposite thing we were looking for. We've got the darker version of her and the lighter version of the sky. You can see this is revealing the light version and hiding her, so we're seeing the dark version through that gaping hole in the center. What if we inverted this layer mask? Command, oh, there we go. So now we have the light version of her, the dark version of the sky. Awesomeness. Is a channel mask always going to be perfect? Now in this case, we had those issues of those little bits of grayness in there. And if we look in the image, you'll notice in the flowers here, there's a bit of a washed out contrast in the highlight areas because it's still partly hidden on the lighter versions. We're seeing that darker version showing through. Well, I can just take a paintbrush and some, in this case, some white paint and paint it over top. With a soft brush or a hard brush? A hard brush, yes. A soft brush works fine over here, but if I get down to here, uh-oh, I'm hazing over the edge, or I can't get close enough. But with a hard-edged brush, I can get right up against the, against the edge, and with a shift-clicking technique, I can really quickly make my way around, and I don't have to worry about accidentally going over the edge there. All right. It still may not be perfect. Like if I were to look at this here and I zoom in and, oh, there's an odd kind of double fringe around here. It was still a fairly high contrast edge. What could I do to play around with the softness of that edge there? See how it's a really hard edge here, and it's resulting in this kind of, there's the darker version coming in behind. There's the lighter version there. We've got some problems going on. What could I do about dodge and burn in combination? Well, it's the layer mask that we're dealing with here. I don't want to have to go in. I could take a paintbrush and I could try to like hide that or reveal it. But what if I simply softened this edge here? Like we got this blur tool, and that's a really hard edge down there. But if I use the blur tool, I could soften that edge. So that can often help when you're doing channel masking. If the edge is coming out a little bit too contrasty, a little bit too harsh, really noticeable around the bangles here, well, that can kind of help soften out that edge. With this one here, you remember we dropped that sky in behind, and we kind of talked about the idea of the blending modes being a set of rules that defines how a layer interacts with the layers below. So if I threw this sky over top, and I think we did this back in the first week of the second semester there, which blending mode seemed to work most for this? Was it lighten or soft light or darken? In darken blending mode, the rule is the pixels are visible only if they're capable of darkening the pixels below. And if we look at the original image, well, this is all white up here. Well, pretty much anything can darken white. So it doesn't matter what kind of detail we have in that sky, it's going to show up. Down below, it has to be darker than this tree for it to show up. And nothing in the sky is darker than the tree, so it kind of nicely masks itself around. It does, however, show up in some of these areas around in here, because it is capable of darkening, well, certainly the white in the windows there. We also decided that the sky is a little bit too dark for this image. This image, it's a, kind of an overcast, cloudy day. So we said that sky is probably too dark for that image. If we wanted to lighten up this sky in a non-destructive fashion, what could we use? An adjustment layer, something to clip. So if we threw on like the levels or a curves, I'll just use levels because it's fairly simple, and we start brightening up the sky, It's non-destructive, but it's also brightening the castle. So that's where the clipping mask comes in. And again, there's a bunch of ways you can create clipping masks. I could hold down the Option key, and when I hover over this little, see the little line in between the layers there? If you hover over them, you see this little symbol appear if you're holding the Option key. And if I click, doink, you can see that adjustment layer jumps to the right a few pixels, and that little arrow appears pointing directly to the sky. So it's now only affecting the sky. You can also go to this little pop-up here and choose Create Clipping Mask, or Option Command G is the keyboard shortcut. Or because it's an adjustment layer, look at this symbol. Doesn't that look suspiciously like what you get when you hold the Option key over there? This will also create and release clipping masks. So it's a nice fast way of getting it to if you're on an adjustment layer. We did decide that it was showing up in some inappropriate places still, even though it's lighter, still showing up in those windows. So we just gave this a layer mask. And with a paintbrush. And again, a hard-edged brush as opposed to a soft. It doesn't matter in the areas around here, but when we get to things right up against the edge, like these windows here, a soft-edged brush gave us that weird kind of electric glow around the building if we got close enough to the edge. Hard-edged brush avoids that. So if you're doing retouching, clone stamp on people's faces, stuff like that, usually a soft edge brush for retouching. But if you have fairly hard edges, or you're getting close up to against hard edges there, you'll want to use a hard edge brush. Also shift clicking, good chance to use that. We've got a rooftop along here, and maybe I've had too much coffee and I can't do a straight line anymore. I could do a click here, boink, and then a shift click, boink, and it jumps between those 2 points. So in that case, it was the darken blending mode. Rules says pixels are visible only if you're capable of darkening the pixels below. And obviously, if we did lighten, it would be the opposite of that. The other blending mode that we took a look at was the same one we used for Moray. This is a thing that we recalled here. So we said, okay, well, if you made a new layer, popped it into color blending mode, took a paintbrush, sampled the color we want it to be, and painted over top. We want green here, we paint that over top, and everybody's happy except for the sky, which has this nastiness happening. What do we do to stop it from affecting the sky so it can only affect the branches in here?
Break that layer to on top of the background?
On top of the background. We only want it to affect the background. It's affecting the sky as well. If we drag it so it's below the sky and above the background, it can only affect the background. Okay. Oh, the other one, another blending mode, and it was the very first one, and we talked about it with the wrinkles and stuff. If there's texture in the background, you can't use the clone stamp for it. So in this case, we talked about the idea of redirecting your viewer's attention, kind of using it, brightness to tell a different story. When you first look at a photograph, your eyes tend to go to the brightest areas, so you notice, oh, look, there's some birds down there. Hey, there's some lights up there. Hey, there's a store over there. And hey, there's the sky up there. But maybe that's not the story you want to tell. What's a blending mode that would let us lighten and darken, but in a non-destructive way? Like if I took the dodge and burn tools, there's no technical reason why I couldn't take the dodge and burn and darken down here, darken there, and then we do some lightening around here. But if I do it directly to these pixels, remember that analogy, the elastic string, the beads on it? It's like grabbing that middle bead, pulling it to one side, losing some shades of gray. Oh, now we want to lighten up that area because it got a little too dark. Grab the new middle bead, pull it this way, lose some more shades of gray. And I mentioned I was working with a photographer I was doing some printing for her, and she had done that. She'd wanted to be all kind of moody, so she darkened down this side over here, and there's some people coming down the stairs, and then she lightened up the people, and then darkened around the people, and then lightened the faces, and then darkened around the eyes, and then lightened the people. And there was so much noise and banding. We got something out of it, but it could have been a lot better if she had done something like this. Okay, the nice thing about this technique, it uses a blending mode, and we're kind of talking about blending modes here. If I pop it into soft light, I could take a paintbrush, and with some black paint, I could, whoops, okay, that would be white paint, and that would be a hard edge brush, and very high opacity. With that slightly lower opacity and some black paint, I can say, don't look over here. Don't worry about that sign. Pigeons, what pigeons? I could do some vignetting, that darkening around the outside, where, Camera Raw lets you do vignetting, remove it, but it also lets you add vignetting. And then with some white paint, I could lighten up in the center there. And that tells a very different story than this. Here you're kind of like, oh yeah, lights, sky, birds. Here you're like, hey, I wonder what's going on down the middle of the street there. Maybe there's a little bistro or something. You want to kind of go deeper into the image. One thing to keep in mind if you are using the soft light dodge and burn layer, and sometimes this pops up, when you make this transparent layer and pop it into soft light blending mode, will the dodge and burn tools still work? I was painting with black and white paint, wasn't I? I took a paintbrush, and by painting with white, I could lighten, and by painting with black, I could darken. What would the dodge and burn tools, the actual dodge and burn, do on this layer? Absolutely nothing. I can dodge all I want, I can burn all I want, nothing's going to happen because there's no pixels on this layer. The dodge and burn tools rely on having pixels to either lighten or darken. If I did want to use the dodge and burn tools, what would I have to do to this layer? There's something interesting about the soft light blending mode. What does 50% gray do? Like if I took a paintbrush and I painted some black down here, that's going to darken, and I painted some white over here, that's going to lighten. And in normal blending mode, you see them for exactly what they are. But if I selected some 50% gray and painted it right down the middle, in soft light, it does nothing. The black is darkening, the white is lightening, the 50% gray isn't doing anything. And you guys will probably remember this image. And you may also remember this from a previous test. In soft light, there it is. There's that 50% gray doing absolutely nothing. You can see the black is darkening, the white is lightening, the 50% gray is doing nothing. And the other ones we took a look at, one was darken blending mode. So if you're doing the sky, in this case black darkens. The white can't darken anything, but if we popped it into lighten blending mode, the black can't lighten anything, but the white can lighten pretty much everything. And what would you expect to see if I put this into that color blending mode? What color do these squares have? In color, they would only be able to impose their color onto the pixels below. And what color do they have? For something in Photoshop to have a color, there has to be a difference between the red, green, and blue levels. If the RGB values are the same, like if I put it over the gray here, 128, 128, 128. If I put it over the white, 255, 255, 255. If I put it over the black, 0, 0, 0. As long as the RGB values are the same, and this gray ramp here, you can see those RGB values are always the same. There is no color. So there's no color in white, there's no color in black, there's no color in 50% gray. So if I were to pop this into color blending mode, the only thing it can do is impose its color onto the layers below. And if it has no color, can't change the brightness down here so we don't see it at all. Here it just says, oh, you have no color anymore. Basically makes it grayscale. There's one other thing I wanted to go over. The Liquify tool. We talked about the Liquify tool. It works in a bit of a different way. It actually calls into kind of a secondary program that runs within Photoshop. Like, you know, Adobe Camera Raw, you're not within Photoshop. Liquify, you're not within Photoshop. You're in like a little submodule within. And for something like these wrinkles around here, like these you could probably dodge and burn. There's a little bit of texture in there. But something like this, where you're not going to dodge and burn or clone these wrinkles out. First off, should these wrinkles be completely removed? Not necessarily. Smoothed out a little bit. Here's the version that I sent into the client. You can see how it's still there, but it's been squished in a little bit. And you can see the work that was done on the, oh wow, the projector is quite dark. But if you look on your own images, you'll see that, yeah, there's still some wrinkles in here. But this, that was a Liquify. I'm just going to duplicate the layer. If I go under Filter, Liquify. Again, the Liquify tool works in a different way from what you're used to. If I were to push things around, it's not actually moving any pixels. What is moving here? A mesh that has been stuck over top of the image. And if we zoom in, there's that mesh. Now, he distinctly looks warped. But I haven't changed, like this isn't actually changing any pixels in the image. What has been distorted? What do I see that's being distorted here? It's called a proxy image. It's just something that stands in for the actual image. Pixels don't get moved until I hit OK. Now, in this case, I don't want to do that, so I'm just going to restore all. But for these little wrinkles down here, rather than going in and trying to completely straighten it, and you know, you could take a clone stamp and just shave that edge right off, but that's the way the fabric wants to fall. Now, if the client did want stuff straightened out, do it. But for something like this, I would probably just kind of gently nudge them inwards a little bit. And the basic tool here is just the forward warp. And we've got your size, pressure, density. And we can just kind of nudge those things inwards a little bit. If I did have to smooth it out completely, like maybe they said this little warp along here, they want to get rid of it completely, set the middle of the brush over it and pull it inwards until we have a nice straight curve around. Same thing down around the ankle here. If they wanted this stuff here smoothed out, pull her inwards, bit of a smaller brush, pull her inwards, and try to adjust the size of the brush based on the size of the wrinkles. You could pull that one in, and we could pull that one back out. Now, there could be little bits where it's not quite going to work. Those things you could clone out. Like if I hit the OK button on that, and I zoomed in on these little bumpy bits down here. I could take my clone stamp, grab this edge, and just push that across to fill that gap in. If it's a fairly, like a sharp V, the Liquify tool, if you were to pull that out flat, there'd be so much stretching in that middle part that you'd see pixels kind of getting stretched into like, looks like some kind of weird like motion blur sort of effect. So you can do a little bit of cloning if you need to. If the inside here was all the same sort of tone, I could take a brush, sample some of this texture on the inside, and clone it right up against the edge. And again, here's that shift clicking technique that lets you just kind of jump in between the points and fill those little gaps up. So there's a lot of different ways you can soften those edges out. I think that should about, in theory, cover it.